Hey, what's up everyone? Seja here, founder of the School of Evolutionary Herbalism. And it's kind of funny to think about an herb as being famous. But if we think about all the medicinal plants, what is the most famous herb? Well, I would say it probably, arguably so, would be Echinacea. This is an herb that, even people that aren't herbalists have heard of Echinacea. It's been very well studied, and with good reason. This plant has amazing properties, incredible healing attributes. But one of the things about this herb is that when science gets a hold of a plant, it's really common that sometimes some of the traditional properties of it are forgotten or overlooked. Echinacea, of course, as we all know it, as the immune stimulant, right? But traditionally, this is not actually how this plant was used. So I'm really excited to share with you some of the holistic properties of Echinacea and kind of compare and contrast some of the traditional uses with the modern uses, and hopefully we can bring them together to have a really good understanding of how to work with this plant holistically. All right, so here we are in our little baby patch of Echinacea purpurea. These were actually some starts from my mom that we put into the garden, so it's kind of fun to have some plants from my mom. So this is Echinacea purpurea, and yeah, let's just start off talking about the taste of this herb. So Echinacea has a very distinct taste, and anyone that's ever taken some Echinacea tincture knows that it is a very lively, active flavor. So first off, we would consider this plant to be pungent in nature. It is very stimulating to the senses, to the sense of taste, but it's not pungent like hot and spicy, like taking something like cayenne pepper. It's more of a stimulating to just kind of your whole taste buds and taste receptors in that way. It's kind of hard to explain. One of the better ways, I think, to explain the nature of the taste of Echinacea is a word we refer to as diffusive. And the diffusive taste it's like a tingling sensation on your tongue and in your mouth. It ends up translating oftentimes into an action that's referred to as sialagogue, which means it increases salivation. So anytime you see that word gog, that means it stimulates the secretion, and typically whatever is in front of gog is referring to what it stimulates. So a sialagogue stimulates salivation, a galactagogue stimulates lactation, a cholagogue stimulates gallbladder or bile secretions. So this is a diffusive remedy, and what we oftentimes see with diffusive plants is that it translates to an affinity typically for the circulatory system and cardiovascular system. So we're seeing a stimulation to blood flow and circulation, and that's one of the key actions with Echinacea here, is that it very effectively stimulates blood flow out into the periphery. And so that's one of its main affinities there, is for the blood and for the cardiovascular system. Of course, one of our other main affinities that is Echinacea's claim to fame is for the immune system. So this plant has been very well researched in terms of its activation of local and systemic immunity, stimulating T-cell response, stimulating macrophages, stimulating B cells, like all attributes of the immune system are stimulated through the use of Echinacea. And that's kind of what's led to its modern day usage, really, whenever anyone gets sick in any way, shape, or form, oftentimes. I guess in terms of like some sort of an infection, people reach for Echinacea, and it's debatable how effective Echinacea is in that way. I mean, a lot of times it's used for like coughs, colds, and flus, and we always lump those three together, even though a flu is very different from a cold. But usually at the initial onset of some sort of immune situation like that, Echinacea is what is reached for. And there's been a lot of different research on its efficacy, especially in upper respiratory tract infections, like for a cold or for some sort of respiratory infection like bronchitis or cough and things like that. But so the immune system is one of the main organ affinities here. And then the other one that's very commonly overlooked actually is the lymphatic system. Echinacea is an amazing herb for swelling in the lymphatics, which typically accompanies infection. So, the whole function of the lymphatic system is to clean the blood. It's to clear metabolic waste products out of the extracellular fluids, to purify the blood. Typically, when you have some form of infection, your immune system is kind of waging war, so to speak, on that pathogen. You have dead bacteria or viral cells in the body. You've got dead immunological components. You have accumulation of metabolic waste products that the lymph is designed to filter and clean. Now, when there's a whole bunch of those metabolic waste products, sometimes the lymphatics can't keep up. Especially, as many know, the lymph doesn't have a pump on its own. It's really necessitates our movement in order for the lymph to move. And when you're sick, oftentimes what are we doing? We're laying around in bed. So the lymph can get overburdened and you end up with swollen lymph nodes, the neck, under the armpits, the inguinal region. It typically depends on where the localized site of infection is. But point being, Echinacea has an amazing affinity for the lymphatics. So those are the main organ affinities that I tend to think of with Echinacea: the immune system, the blood, and connected to it, circulation, and the lymphatics. It's also a great skin and topical remedy. So, we could say it has an affinity. I don't really think of it as having an affinity for the skin, because affinity is usually, I think of it as like when you take it internally, where does it travel to? Typically with topical things, we're just putting it locally on the site that it needs to be placed upon. So let's talk about some of the actions of Echinacea. So as mentioned, it's an immune stimulant, right? It is acutely stimulating all aspects of the immune system, which is really, really great for really any manner of infection. And this is where Echinacea is very, very versatile. So you can combine it with respiratory agents like OSHA, lomatium, elecampane, and that immune stimulation will be driven into the lungs. You can combine it with uva ursi and buchu and pipsissewa and drive it into the urinary tract. You can give it with Oregon grape and wormwood and golden seal, and it's going to go into the intestines. Whatever you combine Echinacea with, you're able to, in a way, deliver it to the particular organ system where you want it to act upon. But it is a systemic remedy, so it will be stimulating immunity systemically, and that leads to a whole wide range of uses for this plant. But again, as I was saying earlier, that's kind of, it's like science is great, and it's great when we discover properties about plants, but I feel like it's really important not to pigeonhole herbs. And Echinacea is one of those plants that I think has really become kind of pigeonholed, and really the way a lot of folks use it is like for a cold, where they feel themselves getting sick, so they load up on Echinacea. And there's that old saying of there's no cure for the common cold, because the common cold is the cure. Like, if you're pushing yourself too hard in your life, you're not getting enough sleep, you're not eating well, you're stressed out, you're going, you're kind of depleting yourself. Sometimes getting that cold or getting sick and laying you out for a few days is kind of just what you need. It's like forcing you to stop, forcing you to slow down. And one of the things that is a little bit unfortunate about the way people use Echinacea is at the initial onset of any kind of symptom, people start loading up on Echinacea, taking, dropperfuls every 30, 60 minutes. But then they don't couple that with bed rest and kind of slowing it down. So I'll just load up on my Echinacea and keep going. And that can actually, in the long run, be worse for the system, because you're not allowing the body to rest and recharge and rejuvenate. You're kind of still overstimulating the system. So we got to be a little bit careful with how Echinacea is used. And I feel like it's one of those plants that, I don't want to say is abused, but I feel like it is oftentimes used out of context from a holistic approach to healing, which is listening to the vital force, listening to the wisdom of the body and following it. So that's just my little rant on immune stimulation, and I guess some of the, not dangers or risks, but I guess for lack of a better term, I'll use those words, associated with Echinacea. Other main action of this plant, this is how this herb was traditionally used in Western herbalism, is as an alterative. So this is an amazing remedy used to purify the blood, purify the extracellular fluids, purify the lymphatics. So I would say it specifically is a lymphatic alterative. And I was kind of explaining how that works a little bit ago, but this is really the traditional usage of Echinacea. It was used for things like blood poisoning, sepsis, like deep levels of infection. People get, an infection and then they start seeing that like red stripe go up a limb, that's a really serious situation. That's traditionally how Echinacea was used, was as a very deep antiseptic remedy to purify the blood, of very deep levels of infection. But in conjunction with that property, it's also, in many First Nations cultures that worked with this plant in the plains, it would be kind of classified as a snake medicine because it's used for snake bites. They say there's the signature of it is that the flowering cone kind of in a way can kind of resemble the tail of a rattlesnake. And so they say any type of poisonous sting or bite, but especially rattlesnakes, brown recluse spiders, black widow spiders, anything where that bite, there's the secretion of some sort of venom or toxin into the blood, Echinacea is key, both topically as well as internally. So the way I was taught to use Echinacea is like, if you get bit by a rattlesnake, drink a whole 1 ounce bottle of Echinacea. If you can, put some on topically while you're on your way to the hospital, right? This isn't like, oh no, you're fine, just take some Echinacea and you'll be all good. Like, you should still go to the hospital if you get bit by a rattlesnake or, even a brown recluse, because a lot of those can be very necrotic venoms that literally like eat away and dissolve tissue, which can be very dangerous. But that's a very traditional usage of Echinacea is for and it's associated with that deep level blood poisoning, basically. So these are some of the main actions that I tend to think of with Echinacea. I don't find it to have very much of like a diaphoretic property, or, it's not a remedy I tend to think of specifically for fever. Which is interesting because it is so pungent and aromatic and stimulant. It's like I taste it and I'm like, oh, I'm surprised it doesn't stimulate sweating, but in my experience with it, it's not really that effective as a diaphoretic. I personally prefer remedies like elderflower, yarrow, things like that. So getting into the energetics of Echinacea. So this is where we see an interesting kind of almost like contradiction, it seems like, with this plant, in that the energetics of this herb, it's actually cooling. So it's very rare that we find a pungent aromatic stimulant herb with a cooling net energetic property. And the only other remedy that I can really think of there is like yarrow is cooling and stimulates circulation. Elderflower stimulates a little bit of peripheral circulation and also is cooling. But a lot of our circulatory stimulants are hot plants: cayenne, ginger, prickly ash, black pepper, a lot of the aromatic mints. So Echinacea is a cooling stimulant, right? Very, very unique property, very useful property, especially in the sense that typically when there's infection going on like that, there's also a lot of inflammation. So Echinacea is really great because it's going to purify the blood, purify the lymph, stimulate the immunity, help support the body in fighting off the infection, cool down the inflammation in the localized tissue, and in that way, ultimately shorten the lifespan of that initial infection. So this is an herb that I really love formulating with because it's so versatile. It's kind of like lobelia. It's like it works systemically, but you can drive it into a particular organ or system or tissue based on how you formulate with it. So that lends this plant a lot of versatility. I think it's a must-have plant in your home first aid kit, a travel first aid kit, anytime you're on the road or anything like that. It's always a good idea to have a bottle of Echinacea on hand. The powder as well is really useful for those topical uses as well. And so cooling, stimulant, it is going to be a bit more on the drying side. And in that way, it is really good for alleviating kapha and pitta. So kapha being dampness, accumulation, stagnation. Anytime there's an excess moisture accumulation in the body and basically toxicity accumulation, it's really good. That's really when we use alteratives, coupled with an excess of pitta or heat, inflammation in the tissues, and things like that. So that's typically how I think of it from the perspective of the doshas. But of course, you know, and this is one thing, just a little side note, I get this question all the time from students, and people tend to get really confused in regards to like the doshas of Ayurveda and constitutional models and herbs and energetics. So people like, oh, well, I'm a Vata constitution, but I've got this really damp condition in my body, but I don't want to take these herbs to treat the damp condition because it'll aggravate the Vata. And this is really, really important for everyone to understand, is that when there is an acute situation, you kind of ignore the constitution in a way. Like, there's the whole constitution of the person, but then each organ system and tissue has its own constitution, and it's very important that you treat what's right in front of you. And they say that in Ayurveda, you know, you have prakruti, your core constitution of the whole being, and then you have the vikruti, or the assumed constitution, or the imbalanced state. And that also exists within an organ. So even if you're a Vata, cold, dry, tense person, and you've got a really damp, phlegmatic cough, you don't really have to worry about giving a drying expectorant and aggravating your Vata constitution, because acutely you have dampness and too much kapha in the lungs, so you treat that. So it's a little side note, but it is a question that I get a lot, and it seems to be a really big point of confusion amongst the herbalist community that are working with constitutional systems, trying to understand their own constitution and how to work with the herbs in that model. So that's just a little side note there on that. So these are some of the ways that I like to work with Echinacea and how to understand it holistically, its core properties. And we'll hear from Whitney here about growing and harvesting this plant.
Echinacea is a native to North America and to be found growing in the Midwest and the plains. The natural environment that it grows in has been pretty much destroyed. There's very few prairies left in the Midwest like that. So it's a cultivated variety is what we often find. So it's one that you can grow relatively easily. These plants we grew from dividing root crowns. So the plants will grow little rootlets, and you can kind of gently separate them and then replant. Each little sprout, each little rootlet can become its own plant, which is what we did here with these. And it also grows well from seed. So the seeds can be started in the fall. It takes about 4 weeks for the seeds to germinate, so they need plenty of time starting in the fall or the early spring. They do like the cold to get going. So if you're going to start them from seed, be sure to get an early start on them as well. And as far as harvesting the plant, the flowers are used medicinally, so you can harvest the flowers like this and tincture those. I find that the flowers tend to have a little bit more of that lymphatic kind of action, tend to have quite a strong sialagogue action as well. And I tend to use the flower tincture in general when I feel a little bit more bogged down in my lymph system, versus the root I would kind of reach for when I'm needing a little bit more of that direct immune action. Even though both of them have both of those actions. That's just kind of my preference with how I use the flower versus the root. So the flowers can be harvested whole like this and tinctured, and then if you wait to harvest the roots in the fall, on about the 3rd or 4th year, you want to give the plant some time to actually establish a nice sized root before harvesting. So you dig up the roots in the fall, and you can tincture those fresh as well, which we would tincture about 60% alcohol or so. And then that's pretty much the main way that we use Echinacea, is just in a tincture like that. Seijo was mentioning it's helpful to have a little bit of root powder in your first aid kit as a poultice for pulling out any, like he was saying, a bite or a sting or something like that could be used mixed with some. You could also use it with a tobacco poultice or plantain poultice, mixing the root powder. So to prepare a root powder, you would harvest the roots, dry them thoroughly, and then break them up, and you can grind them up in like a coffee grinder or something like that. That's a blender if you can, but it can be pretty hard to grind up some of those roots. But you probably can find Echinacea root powder commercially available pretty easily as well. So that's a little bit about Echinacea. It's just lovely to grow and a really important herb to have around. It's incredibly versatile, as Seijo was sharing about all of its medicinal virtues, and it's like having it in the garden, it's just like the hallmark of the herbalist's garden. It's lovely to have.
All right, so let's talk about Echinacea from the esoteric perspective. So looking at it through the lens of medical astrology, this is a really, really great example of a Mars plant, which I'm like kind of excited to talk about, because I feel like after shooting so many of these videos down in the garden over the last couple months, I've been realizing, wow, we grow a lot of Venus plants. And so I feel like I've been talking about Venus a lot lately. So I'm kind of excited to share about a different planet today. So Mars is the planet associated with the immune system. This is the planet that is commonly, in astrology, governs our energy. It's our dynamic energy and like the force that moves us and makes us do things. It is also the archetype of the warrior. And, if we think of the sun as like our essence, Mars is what defends and protects that essence. And so in the sense of our physiology, that's what our immune system does, right? It is defending and protecting the body from invasion. So what happens when our immune system typically gets acutely activated? Well, our inflammatory responses kick in gear. Those also are governed by Mars. As the red planet governs iron, it also governs the blood, which obviously is red. And as we saw, Echinacea is a really choice alterative blood purifying plant, stimulating circulation. The taste of Echinacea is so clearly Mars, like that really tingly, activated, like it's stimulating all of those salivary secretions, and it's just stimulating. And that whole stimulant property is very Martian as well. We also see some of that signature in kind of the lance-shaped leaves, and then on these on the tops here, what we would consider actually the disc flowers, ray flowers, disc flowers. They're really prickly too and kind of sharp. And that prickliness and sharpness is also very indicative. It's like a Mars signature, as well as just the red coloration moving up there. And the purple color actually, while I don't think of the purple color as a Mars signature per se, we do see this. The purple color is oftentimes a signature of blood stagnation, and herbs that move the blood and stimulate circulation of the blood. So we see that in other herbs like angelica, the way the stalks of angelica get those purple splotches. We see that in poke root, the purple coloration of the poke berries. A lot of purple colored plants oftentimes will relieve blood stagnation and things like that. So this is a really great Mars plant. In that way, we tend to work with it on Tuesday under the Mars hours when we like to harvest and process all of our Echinacea. And then elementally speaking, just because that's what this plant does, I tend to think of it as a fire element plant. And for all the same reasons really that are associated with Mars there, it also relates to the fire element. So those are some of the esoteric properties of this plant. I don't really think this herb too much in terms of like, I don't know, I guess I don't really think so much of like any particular psychological pattern or anything, you know, in the psyche that I tend to think of with Mars, because it is such an acute use plant typically. Well, I guess actually that's another example of Mars is the injury. Like Mars is what draws blood, and Mars also typically is associated with like attacks or accidents and things like that. So if you think of like a snake or a spider biting you, that's kind of a Mars experience, right? Causing injury to your person, and blood to be shed. But in terms of psyche and things like that, I don't really personally know of anything there associated with Echinacea, aside from the need for a little bit of a boost in the Mars part of the system there. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an understanding of Echinacea beyond the immune stimulant properties. I feel like this is such a useful herb beyond just the cough, cold, and flu pigeonhole that it's kind of been put into over the last number of decades. And hopefully you learned something good about Echinacea. I've got a whole lot more I could say about this herb, and really if you want the full deep dive monograph on Echinacea, I want to encourage you to check out our monthly subscription program, Materia Medica Monthly, where we cover Materia Medica, a single plant, typically 2 to 3 hours of video content on each individual plant. Our monographs are usually over 20 pages. I believe these are the most in-depth, comprehensive monographs on plants available. So head on over to our website at evolutionaryherbalism.com. Play around in there till you find some stuff about Materia Medica Monthly. You can sign up for our newsletter and get an issue for free. And we do cover Echinacea in that program, and of course you can feel free to continue to enjoy all of the free content that we share on our YouTube channel, on our podcast The Plant Path, over on our blog, and daily on Instagram and Facebook. So thanks so much for joining me in this episode. Until the next one, take care and be well.